I watched the HOA president yank my private road no through traffic sign straight out of the ground like she was pulling a weed. Her face twisted in that special kind of rage only suburban power can create. That sign had cost me $200 and 3 hours of my Saturday to install, and now it was lying in the dirt next to my driveway while Patricia Donnelly stood there with her hands on her hips, looking triumphant. "These signs are not approved by the board, Victor," she said, like she was explaining basic math to a child. "They're also against our community standards. You cannot just put up whatever you want." I leaned against my truck, arms crossed, watching her. "Patricia, this is my private property. That's my driveway. It's not even part of the HOA roads. It connects to our roads," she shot back, "and it creates visual pollution. The board voted on it last week. All unauthorized signage must come down." "I wasn't at that meeting." "That's not my problem. You should have attended." I should mention that I live in Meadowbrook Heights, a planned community just outside Columbus, Ohio. It's one of those neighborhoods where every house looks like it came from the same catalog, where the grass has to be exactly 3 inches tall, and where people like Patricia Donnelly somehow end up with enough power to make everyone else's life miserable. I'd bought my property here 5 years ago because the price was right and the location was perfect for my construction business. My house sat at the end of Willow Lane, but unlike the other properties, mine included an extra half-acre that extended back to a county road. I'd paved a private driveway connecting to that road because it gave me a shortcut to the highway without having to wind through the neighborhood every morning with my work truck. The problem started about 6 months after I moved in. People began using my driveway as a cut-through. At first, it was just a few cars here and there. Then it became a regular stream of traffic, especially during morning rush hour. Neighbors who wanted to avoid the main entrance started treating my private road like a public thoroughfare. I tried being nice about it. I'd mentioned it at HOA meetings. I'd sent polite emails. Nothing worked, so 3 weeks ago I'd installed professional road signs at both ends of my driveway. Private property no trespassing on one end, private road authorized vehicles only on the other. They were tasteful, properly mounted, and completely legal since they were on my land. Patricia had apparently taken this as a personal insult. "Those signs need to stay down," she said now, grinding her heel into the dirt for emphasis. "If I see them back up, there will be fines." "Daily fines, Victor. $500 per day per sign. You can't fine me for something on my private property," I said, keeping my voice level. "My driveway isn't part of the HOA. Your property is part of this community, which means it falls under our architectural guidelines. Section 12, subsection 4. I suggest you read it." She walked away before I could respond, leaving my expensive sign lying in the dirt like roadkill. I stood there for a long moment, feeling my jaw clench tighter and tighter. I'm not usually a petty person. I run a construction company. I deal with difficult clients and complicated permits and city inspectors having bad days. I've learned to stay calm, to pick my battles, to handle conflicts professionally. But something about Patricia Donnelly and her little kingdom of tyranny just got under my skin in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I picked up my sign, brushed off the dirt, and carried it to my garage. Then I went inside and dug out my HOA documents, all the paperwork from when I'd bought the place. I spent the next 2 hours going through every page, every clause, every subsection. And guess what? Section 12, subsection 4 said absolutely nothing about private driveways on private property. It covered architectural modifications visible from the street, but my driveway wasn't even visible from any HOA road once you got past my actual house. I drafted an email to the board, carefully citing the specific language in our governing documents, explaining that my signs were within my rights. I kept it professional and factual. I sent it at 6:15 on a Wednesday evening. By Thursday morning, I had a response. Not from Patricia directly, but from the board secretary, a nervous woman named Margaret who always seemed terrified of contradicting Patricia. Dear Mr. Anderson, the board has reviewed your email and stands by its decision. The signs must remain down. Additionally, you are hereby notified of a special assessment in the amount of $1,000 for unauthorized modifications to property affecting community aesthetics. Payment is due within 30 days. Sincerely, the Meadowbrook Heights HOA Board. I read the email 3 times, each time feeling my blood pressure tick up another notch. $1,000 fine for signs on my own property, signs I'd already been forced to take down. I called my lawyer, Doug Winters, a guy I'd worked with on various construction contracts over the years. Can they do this? I asked after explaining the situation. Doug was quiet for a moment. Probably not, but fighting it will cost you more than $1,000. HOAs like this bank on people just paying rather than dealing with the hassle. You'd be looking at legal fees, possibly a lawsuit, definitely a lot of time and aggravation. So they just get away with it. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you need to decide if this is the hill you want to die on. I can send them a letter if you want. See if that scares them into backing down. Send the letter, I said. Doug's letter was professional and threatening in all the right legal ways. He cited case law, referenced the specific limitations of HOA authority, and strongly suggested they withdraw both the fine and the sign prohibition or face legal action. Patricia's response came personally this time. She showed up at my door on Saturday morning with 2 other board members, a balding guy named Robert and a younger woman named Jennifer who looked uncomfortable being there. Your threats are not appreciated, Victor, Patricia said. She dressed for the occasion, wearing what I can only describe as her power suit, like she was going to a corporate board meeting instead of harassing a neighbor. The board has discussed this at length, and we're prepared to escalate if necessary. You're creating discord in this community. I'm trying to keep people from trespassing on my property, I said. No one is trespassing. They're using a road that happens to be convenient. A road I built on my land that I pay to maintain. You're being selfish, Jennifer chimed in, though she looked away when she said it. I took a deep breath. Let me ask you something. If people started walking through your backyard because it was a convenient shortcut, would you be okay with that? That's completely different, Patricia said. How? It just is. Look, we're trying to maintain property values here. Your signs make the neighborhood look unwelcoming. They send the wrong message. To who? To everyone. To potential buyers. To residents. This is supposed to be a friendly community. I almost laughed. You're fining me $1,000 for trying to protect my property, but you want to talk about being friendly. Patricia's face went red. The fine stands, and if those signs go back up, it will be $500 per day, just like I said. We will not be bullied by one resident who thinks he's above the rules. They left, and I stood in my doorway feeling like I'd just been gaslit by a committee. That afternoon, I went for a drive to clear my head. I took the back way out, using my private driveway, and as I turned onto the county road, I noticed something I'd forgotten about. About 50 feet from my property line, right where the HOA roads intersected with the county road, there stood a large covered structure. It was a communal mailbox shelter, one of those things where everyone's mailboxes are grouped together under a roof. This particular shelter was actually quite nice. It had a proper shingled roof, painted posts, even built-in benches where people could sit while sorting their mail. I remembered that shelter well because I'd built it. 3 years ago, shortly after moving in, there'd been a big community discussion about the mailboxes. They'd been individual posts scattered along the road, looking messy and getting knocked over every time a snowplow came through. Patricia had wanted a unified mailbox shelter, but said the HOA didn't have the budget for it. I'd volunteered to build one. I had the skills, the materials, the equipment. I'd done it as a gesture of goodwill, spent about $3,000 of my own money on materials, put in 4 full weekends of work. The community had been grateful. There'd even been a little thank you gathering. The shelter sat on a narrow strip of land between the county road and the HOA property. When I'd built it, I'd checked the property lines carefully because I'd needed to dig post holes and I didn't want to hit any utility lines. What I discovered was that the strip of land where the mailboxes needed to be, according to postal regulations, was actually an easement that belonged to my property. The county road had been reconfigured years before the neighborhood was built, and through some quirk of surveying and boundary adjustments, that little 10-foot strip technically belonged to my lot. I'd never mentioned it to anyone. It hadn't seemed important at the time. I'd been happy to help the community, and where the mailbox shelter sat didn't really matter for practical purposes. But now, sitting in my truck looking at that shelter, I felt something shift in my chest. I drove home and pulled out my property survey, the official one from when I'd bought the house. I traced the boundary lines with my finger. Sure enough, that strip of land was marked as part of my property, with an easement for road access but nothing about mailbox structures. I called Doug again. Hypothetically, I said, if I built something on my own property as a favor to my neighbors and then those neighbors started treating me like garbage, could I remove what I built? There was a pause. What did you build, Victor? I explained about the mailbox shelter. Doug whistled. That's a nice bit of leverage you've got there. But you'd need to be careful. If you're going to remove it, you need to do it by the book. Give proper notice. Make sure you're not violating any postal regulations or creating a safety hazard. But legally, I could do it. If it's on your property and you built it with your own money, yes. But Victor, this is going to escalate things. You know that, right? Things are already escalated, I said. They're threatening to fine me $500 a day for putting up signs on my own driveway. Fair point. Want me to draft a notice for you? Yeah, I said. Let's do this right. The notice went out on Monday. It was formal and legal, addressed to the HOA board and all residents of Meadowbrook Heights. It explained that the mailbox shelter currently serving the community was located on private property belonging to me, that it had been constructed at my personal expense as a courtesy to the community, and that I was hereby providing 30 days' notice of my intention to remove the structure. The notice cited the property survey, included a copy of the relevant plat map, and explained that residents should make alternative arrangements for mail delivery. I hand-delivered copies to Patricia, Robert, and Jennifer. I posted copies at the mailbox shelter itself. I sent it via certified mail to the HOA's registered address. Then I waited. It took about 4 hours for my phone to start ringing. The first call was from a neighbor named Susan who lived 2 houses down. Victor, what's this about the mailbox shelter? You can't just remove it. Where will we get our mail? The Postal Service will provide individual mailboxes, I said. Like most people have. But that will look terrible, and it will cost money. Everyone will have to buy their own mailbox and post. I spent $3,000 building that shelter, I said. For free? Well, yes, but that was a gift to the community. No, it was a courtesy, on my property, and now that same community is fining me for trying to mark my private driveway. She hung up. The calls kept coming, Some people were angry, some were confused. A few were sympathetic, but said they couldn't go against the HOA board. By evening, my phone was ringing so constantly that I just turned it off. Patricia showed up at 7:30, and this time she brought what looked like half the board and a handful of other residents. "This is extortion," she said before I'd even fully opened the door. "You're trying to blackmail the board into letting you break the rules." "I'm exercising my property rights," I said calmly, "just like you told me you were doing. That mailbox shelter serves the entire community. On my property, that I pay taxes on, you built it for everyone as a courtesy. When I thought I was part of a community that respected each other, turns out I was wrong." Robert stepped forward, trying to play peacemaker. "Look, Victor, maybe we can work something out. What if we withdraw the fine and you leave the shelter alone?" "What about my signs?" I asked. Patricia cut in before Robert could answer. "The signs are non-negotiable. They violate community standards. Even though they're on my private property, and your community standards don't legally apply to private driveways." "That's your interpretation," Patricia said. "That's what the governing documents actually say," I countered. We went back and forth like that for another 10 minutes before they finally left. Patricia's parting shot was that they'd get a restraining order preventing me from touching the mailbox shelter. I told her to go ahead and try. The next day I got a call from the postmaster for our area, a pleasant woman named Carol Martinez. "Mr. Anderson, I received a rather frantic call from your HOA about mailbox changes. Can you help me understand what's going on?" I explained the situation, keeping it factual. Carol sighed. "So the shelter is on your property?" "Yes, madam. And you're within your rights to remove it, according to my attorney, yes." "Well, this is going to be a headache for everyone. Those folks will need to install individual mailboxes at the street." "Do you know how many residents we're talking about?" 43 homes, I said. "Lord help me. Okay, here's what I need. If you're serious about removing that shelter, I need to know exactly when so I can notify our carriers and work with the residents on new mailbox locations. This isn't something that can happen overnight. I understand. I'm giving 30 days notice. I'm not trying to create problems for you or the mail carriers." "I appreciate that. Between you and me, HOAs are the bane of my existence. They want everything to look pretty, but don't want to follow any of the actual regulations." Over the next week, the tension in Meadowbrook Heights went from bad to worse. I'd see neighbors in their yards and they'd either look away quickly or glare at me. Someone left a nasty note on my truck. There were posts on the community Facebook page calling me selfish, petty, vindictive. A few people defended me, pointing out that the HOA had started this by overreaching their authority, but they were shouted down. Patricia called an emergency HOA meeting. I attended, mostly because I wanted to see what they'd do. The community center was packed. Patricia stood at the front with a PowerPoint presentation like she was running a corporate shareholder meeting. The presentation was titled "Protecting Our Community Values" and featured a picture of my mailbox shelter on the first slide. "As you all know," Patricia began, "we're facing an unprecedented situation. One resident has decided that his personal grievances are more important than the well-being of our entire community." I raised my hand. "Point of order. Can we talk about what actually happened?" "You'll have time to speak," Patricia said dismissively. Her presentation went on for 20 minutes. She talked about community standards, about property values, about the importance of a unified aesthetic vision. She showed before and after pictures of neighborhoods with visual clutter versus clean, organized signage. She never once mentioned that my signs were on my private driveway or that I'd built the mailbox shelter with my own money. When she finally let me speak, I stood up and kept it simple. 3 weeks ago, I installed signs on my private driveway to stop people from trespassing. The signs were on my property, not HOA property. The HOA doesn't have authority over my private driveway, which you can verify by reading Section 12, subsection 4 of our governing documents. Instead of acknowledging this, the board decided to fine me $1,000 and threaten additional daily fines. So I reviewed my property boundaries and realized that the mailbox shelter I built 3 years ago at my own expense as a free gift to this community is also on my private property. I've given legal notice that I'll be removing it. If the board wants to discuss a resolution, I'm open to that. But I'm not going to be bullied into paying fines for something I have every right to do. There was silence for a moment, then the room erupted. People shouting over each other, some at me, some at the board. Patricia tried to regain control, but it took several minutes. Eventually, Robert suggested a compromise. What if we agree that you can keep your signs and you let the mailbox shelter remain? We can even draw up an agreement giving the HOA a formal easement for the shelter. I considered it. What about the $1,000 fine? Patricia stiffened. The fine was assessed according to the rules that don't actually apply to my private driveway, I said. Your interpretation of the rules, she shot back. We were at an impasse. The meeting ended without resolution. As people filed out, a few neighbors approached me privately. One older gentleman named Frank shook my hand. You're right, you know. Patricia's been running this place like her own little dictatorship for 3 years. About time someone stood up to her. A younger couple, both lawyers apparently, told me they'd been documenting HOA overreach for months and were considering their own legal action. We've got a whole folder of violations where the board exceeded their authority, the husband said, but nobody wants to be the first to sue. That night, I sat in my living room with a beer and really thought about what I was doing. This wasn't just about signs anymore. It wasn't even really about the mailbox shelter. It was about a principle. About whether someone like Patricia could just decide the rules didn't matter when they didn't suit her purposes, could fine people arbitrarily and expect everyone to roll over. I thought about backing down. It would be easier. Less stress. I'd remove the notice, let the mailbox shelter stay, maybe even take down my signs to keep the peace. But then I remembered Patricia's face when she'd yanked my sign out of the ground. The smug satisfaction. The absolute certainty that she could do whatever she wanted because she was the HOA president, and I was just some resident who should know his place. No, I wasn't backing down. The 30-day notice period ticked down. I started planning the actual removal of the mailbox shelter. It would need to be done carefully. The structure was well built because I don't do sloppy work. I'd need to coordinate with the post office to make sure mail service wasn't interrupted. I'd need to dispose of the materials properly. With 2 weeks left on the notice, I received a certified letter from an attorney representing the HOA. It was a cease and desist, claiming that the mailbox shelter had been built with the implied consent and cooperation of the HOA and therefore belonged to the community, not to me. It threatened legal action if I removed it. I forwarded the letter to Doug. His response was swift. This is nonsense. You have receipts for the materials, right? Photos of the construction process, anything documenting that you paid for and built this yourself. All of it, I said. I keep records of everything. Good. Send me copies. I'll draft a response. Doug's reply to the HOA's attorney was a masterpiece. He included copies of my receipts, showing $3,247 in material costs. He included photos from the construction, showing me doing the work. He included my property survey. He pointed out that the HOA had contributed exactly $0 and zero labor to the project. He concluded by noting that if the HOA attempted to prevent me from removing my own property from my own land, we would seek damages and legal fees in court. I didn't hear back from the HOA's attorney, but the community response got worse. Someone started a petition to recall me from the HOA, even though I didn't hold any position to be recalled from. Someone else organized a protest where people stood in front of my house with signs reading, "Save our mailboxes," and "Community over ego." I watched from my window as about 15 people marched back and forth on the sidewalk for an hour before getting bored and going home. The local newspaper got wind of the story. A reporter named Amanda Chen called and asked for an interview. I agreed, figuring I might as well get my side out there. Amanda was thorough. She interviewed me, interviewed Patricia, talked to other residents, even contacted a real estate attorney who wasn't involved in the case for expert opinion. Her article ran in the Columbus Dispatch's community section under the headline "Property Rights Battle Divides Suburban Neighborhood." The article was fair. It presented both sides. It quoted the expert attorney saying that HOAs frequently overstep their authority and that my position appeared legally sound. It also quoted several residents who felt I was being unnecessarily difficult. What the article did, though, was bring attention to the situation beyond just Meadowbrook Heights. I started getting emails and calls from people I'd never met. Some were supportive, sharing their own HOA horror stories. Others were critical, saying I should just be a good neighbor and let things go. A few local construction companies reached out saying they'd heard about the situation and respected what I was doing. One call stood out. It was from a producer at a local TV station asking if I'd be willing to come on for an interview about HOA overreach. I politely declined. I wasn't trying to become some crusader against HOAs in general. I just wanted to be left alone to use my property as I saw fit. With 1 week left on the notice, Patricia made one final attempt at intimidation. She showed up with a police officer. "Officer Bradley here would like to speak with you about your intentions regarding the mailbox shelter," she said, looking triumphant. Officer Bradley, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. He was a young guy, probably in his late 20s, and clearly didn't want to be there. "Sir," he said politely, "I've received a complaint about potential destruction of community property. Can you tell me what's going on?" I invited him in and showed him all my documentation, the property survey, the receipts, the photos, Doug's legal correspondence, everything. Officer Bradley reviewed it all carefully. Then he turned to Patricia, who'd followed us inside. "Madam, this appears to be a civil property dispute. The gentleman has documented that the structure is on his land and that he paid for its construction. There's no criminal matter here. But he's destroying community property," Patricia protested. "With respect, madam, it appears to be his property. If you have a legal claim, you'll need to pursue it through civil court, not through the police department." Patricia's face went purple. She sputtered for a moment, then stormed out. Officer Bradley handed back my documents. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "my parents live in an HOA neighborhood. The board tried to fine them for having the wrong color Christmas lights. I get it." After he left, I felt something release in my chest. The police weren't going to stop me. The HOA's attorney had backed off. Patricia was running out of options. The day before the notice expired, I received an email from Margaret, the board secretary. It was brief and formal. "The board requests one final meeting to discuss resolution before you proceed with removal of the mailbox shelter. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. Community Center." I almost didn't go, But curiosity got the better of me. The meeting was smaller this time, just the board members. Patricia, Robert, Jennifer, and 2 others I didn't know well. No crowd, no presentation, no theatrics. Patricia started. She looked tired, I noticed, less made up than usual. "Victor, we need to resolve this. The community is divided. Property values are being affected. We've had 2 potential home buyers back out of contracts because of the negative attention." "I'm not trying to hurt property values," I said. "I'm trying to protect my property rights." "We understand that now," Robert said. "We may have been too aggressive in our initial response." "May have been." I raised an eyebrow. Jennifer spoke up. "Look, we screwed up, okay?" Patricia pushed for the fine and we went along with it because she's usually right about these things. But this time she wasn't. We're admitting that. I looked at Patricia. She was staring at the table, jaw clenched. "So what are you proposing?" I asked. Robert slid a document across the table. "We withdraw the fine completely. We acknowledge in writing that your private driveway is not subject to HOA signage restrictions. You can keep your signs. In exchange, you grant the HOA a permanent easement for the mailbox shelter to remain on that strip of land." I read through the document. It was actually reasonable. Everything in writing, legally binding, no loopholes I could see. "And the daily fine threat?" I asked. "The $500 per day for the signs," rescinded, Robert said. "Completely. It was never valid anyway." I sat back thinking. This was what I'd wanted from the beginning. My signs, my property rights respected, no fines. The mailbox shelter was nice, but I'd never actually wanted to tear it down. I just wanted leverage to force a reasonable resolution. "I want an apology," I said, "from Patricia specifically. In writing, sent to all residents acknowledging that the board overstepped its authority." Patricia's head snapped up. "Absolutely not." "Then no deal," I said. I started to stand. "Wait," Jennifer said. She looked at Patricia. "For God's sake, swallow your pride for once. Just apologize." "You were wrong." Patricia and I locked eyes. I could see the war happening behind her expression. Pride versus practicality. Control versus compromise. Finally, she looked away. "Fine, I'll send an apology." "Not just you," I said. "The board, taking responsibility as a group for the overreach." "Agreed," Robert said quickly before Patricia could object. We worked out the final details over the next hour. Doug reviewed everything remotely while I sat at the table, and by 9 p.m. we had a signed agreement. The fine was voided. My property rights over my driveway were acknowledged in writing. The HOA received an easement for the mailbox shelter, and the board would send a community-wide email explaining that they'd exceeded their authority and apologizing for the disruption. That email went out the next morning. It was brief and probably written through gritted teeth, but it said what it needed to say. The board had made an error in judgment. My signs were on private property and outside HOA jurisdiction. The matter was resolved. The community reaction was mixed. Some people were relieved it was over. Others felt I'd bullied the board into submission. A few reached out privately to thank me for standing up to Patricia. Life in Meadowbrook Heights slowly returned to normal. I kept my signs up. People mostly stopped using my driveway as a cut-through, though occasionally I'd still get someone who didn't get the message. The mailbox shelter remained, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little proud every time I drove past it and saw neighbors gathering there to collect their mail. Patricia never spoke to me again. We'd pass each other occasionally at the grocery store or driving through the neighborhood, and she'd look right through me like I didn't exist. I was fine with that. About 3 months after everything settled, I got a call from Frank, the older gentleman who'd supported me at the meeting. "Victor, you should know something. Patricia's resigned from the board." "Really?" "Yep." Didn't give a reason. Just sent an email saying she was stepping down effective immediately. Word is she and her husband are moving to a condo downtown. Can't say I'm sorry to hear that, I said. Thought you should know. Also, the new board president is Robert. He asked me to reach out and see if you'd be interested in joining the board. I laughed. Hell no. No offense to Robert, but I've had enough HOA drama to last a lifetime. Fair enough. Can't blame you. That summer, something interesting happened. A new family moved in down the street, a young couple with 2 kids. I met them when they knocked on my door asking about the neighborhood. The husband, a guy named David, mentioned they'd almost bought in a different HOA community but had been put off by all the restrictions. Then we heard about this neighborhood and how the residents stood up for property rights, he said. Read about it in some online forums. Figured if people here actually push back against HOA overreach, it might be a decent place to live. I had to smile at that. The controversy that nearly tore the community apart had actually become a selling point for people who valued reasonable governance over authoritarian control. The following spring, I ended up doing some work on my house, adding a deck to the back. I submitted the architectural plans to the board as required, half expecting a fight. Instead, I got approval within a week with a note from Robert saying everything looked great and they appreciated me following the process. It was such a stark contrast to the previous year that I actually called him to make sure it wasn't a joke. No joke, Robert said. Look, Victor, what happened with Patricia taught us all something. We're supposed to be protecting property values and maintaining standards, not harassing residents over trivial stuff. New boards operating under a different philosophy. We focus on things that actually matter and leave people alone otherwise. That's refreshing, I said. Yeah, well, don't spread it around too much or every burned-out homeowner in Ohio will want to move here. I built my deck that summer. It came out beautiful, redwood with built-in benches and a pergola for shade. I had a little cookout to celebrate its completion and invited some of the neighbors. To my surprise, about 20 people showed up, including several who'd been on Patricia's side during the Mailbox shelter controversy. One woman, Karen actually, that was her name, she cornered me by the grill. She'd been one of the people carrying protest signs that day in front of my house. I owe you an apology, she said. I didn't understand what was really happening. I just heard Patricia's version and went along with it. But after everything came out, after I actually read the HOA documents myself, I realized she'd been lying to us about a lot of things. It's water under the bridge, I said. No, I mean it. She had us all convinced that you were trying to undermine the community. Turns out she was just mad that someone challenged her authority. I'm sorry I believed her without checking the facts. Over the next year, the neighborhood genuinely improved. The new board focused on actual community needs rather than petty control. They organized neighborhood events, maintained common areas, negotiated better rates for services. They operated transparently, posting meeting minutes online and actively soliciting resident feedback. My construction business benefited too. Several neighbors hired me for projects, which was convenient and helped build relationships. I renovated Frank's kitchen, built a shed for David and his family, repaired Jennifer's deck after a storm damaged it. Jennifer and I actually became friendly. She'd been one of the board members who initially supported Patricia, but had turned around once she understood what was really happening. I feel like such an idiot for going along with her for so long, Jennifer told me one afternoon while I was working on her deck. She was just so confident, so certain about everything. It was easier to trust her judgment than to question it. A lot of people are like that, I said. That's how petty tyrants get power. They act like they know best and people assume they must. Never again, Jennifer said firmly. I'm on the board now and I actually read everything. I question everything. I'm that annoying person who asks for documentation and precedent. The board needs people like that, I said. 2 years after the mailbox shelter incident, I was at a city council meeting for work, dealing with some permit issues for a commercial project. During the public comment period, a woman stood up and launched into a complaint about her HOA board refusing to approve her fence design. She was articulate and clearly frustrated, showing photos and citing the relevant documents. I didn't recognize her at first. Then she mentioned the name of her neighborhood and something clicked. I looked more closely. It was Patricia. She'd moved to a condo downtown, but apparently that condo had an HOA too, and now she was on the other side of the power dynamic. The irony was so perfect I almost laughed out loud. After the meeting, I ran into her in the parking lot. She saw me and froze. "Patricia," I said, nodding. "Victor." Her voice was cold. "Heard your comments in there. That's frustrating about your fence." "Yes, well, some boards are unreasonable." "Yeah," I said, "some are." We stood there for an awkward moment. Then Patricia surprised me. "You were right," she said quietly, "about the signs. About property rights. I let the power go to my head and I made everything worse for everyone. I hadn't expected that. Takes guts to admit that. Losing the community I'd worked so hard to build took more guts." She looked away. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what it feels like to have someone else controlling your property for arbitrary reasons." "For what it's worth," I said, "your HOA is wrong about the fence thing." I glanced at the code section they cited. "It doesn't apply to corner lots like yours." She blinked. "Really? Yeah, you might want to push back on that." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Maybe I will." We parted ways after that. I never saw Patricia again, but I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd successfully fought her condo HOA over the fence and had become something of an advocate for HOA reform in Columbus. Apparently, she'd gone to the complete opposite extreme, arguing at city council meetings for stricter limits on HOA authority. People can change, I guess. Sometimes they need to experience their own medicine first. As for me, I still live in Meadowbrook Heights. My signs are still up, marking my private driveway, and they're looking a little weathered now but still functional. The mailbox shelter stands strong, serving the community just like I'd intended when I built it. I've become something of a fixture in the neighborhood, the guy who stood up to the board and somehow made things better for everyone. Frank still stops by occasionally to chat. David's kids, now teenagers, sometimes help me with yard work for extra cash. Jennifer's still on the board, still asking annoying questions and keeping things honest. Robert served as president for 2 years before stepping down, and the neighborhood elected a younger guy named Marcus, who runs the board like a regular community organization instead of a fiefdom. I learned something valuable through all of this, not just about HOAs and property rights, though I learned plenty about those. I learned that standing up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it makes you temporarily unpopular, is sometimes the right thing to do. Not because you want to be difficult or because you enjoy conflict, but because principles matter. Because if people with authority can override legitimate rights without consequence, then those rights don't really mean much at all. The mailbox shelter stands as a reminder of that lesson. Every time I drive past it, I think about how close I came to tearing it down and how glad I am that cooler heads eventually prevailed. The structure serves its purpose, providing shelter for neighbors collecting their mail, a small point of community in an increasingly disconnected world. But I also look at my signs, still standing at both ends of my private driveway, and I feel satisfied. They represent something important too. The idea that even in a community with rules and standards, individual property rights still matter. That being part of an HOA doesn't mean surrendering your autonomy completely. That reasonable people can disagree, fight, and ultimately find compromise. The whole experience changed how I view community governance. I pay attention now to HOA elections, to proposed rule changes, to board meeting minutes. I encourage other residents to do the same, not to be obstructionist or difficult, but to be engaged, to ask questions, to hold boards accountable. Several other residents have told me they do the same now. The mailbox shelter controversy became a watershed moment for Meadowbrook Heights, a line between the old way of doing things and a new, more balanced approach. The neighborhood isn't perfect now. We still have disputes, still have residents who don't maintain their yards properly, still have disagreements over community priorities, but we handle them differently. With more communication, more transparency, more respect for individual rights balanced against community needs. Last month, the board proposed a new rule about holiday decorations, trying to restrict the types of inflatable lawn ornaments people could display. At the community meeting to discuss it, about 30 residents showed up, way more than usually attend. They asked detailed questions. They cited specific language in the governing documents. They pushed back on vague standards and demanded clear, objective criteria. The board withdrew the proposal and went back to the drawing board. That wouldn't have happened 3 years ago. 3 years ago, Patricia would have rammed the rule through and everyone would have grumbled but complied. Now, residents know they have power too. They know they can question authority. They know the board works for them, not the other way around. I'd like to think I played a small role in that cultural shift. Not because I'm special or particularly brave, but because I happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right leverage. The mailbox shelter gave me a card to play that most residents don't have. I used it and it worked out. Would I do it all again if I had to? In a heartbeat. The stress, the confrontation, the temporary unpopularity, all of it was worth it to establish a precedent, to prove that residents don't have to roll over when boards overreach. My only regret is that it took so long to resolve. That 30-day notice period felt like an eternity, with the community divided and everyone on edge. If I'd known then that Patricia would eventually apologize, that the board would come around, that we'd reach a reasonable compromise, I might have been less anxious about the whole thing. But that's the nature of conflicts like this. You don't know how they'll end when you're in the middle of them. You just have to trust your principles, gather your documentation, follow the law, and hold steady. The mailbox shelter still needs maintenance occasionally. Last fall, I noticed the roof was starting to leak in one corner. I could have left it for the HOA to fix, since they now have the official easement. But instead, I bought some supplies and spent a Saturday morning repairing it. Not because I had to, but because I still take pride in the work I do, even when it's no longer technically my responsibility. Several neighbors came by while I was working, thanking me, asking if they could help. We ended up making it a little community project, cleaning up the area around the shelter, repainting the posts, replacing a couple of boards that had rotted. It was a good day, reminded me of why I'd built the thing in the first place. That's the thing about community. It works best when people contribute voluntarily, out of genuine care and connection, not because some board is forcing them to comply with arbitrary standards. The mailbox shelter was always meant to be a gift, a contribution to make the neighborhood a little nicer for everyone. It almost became a weapon in a property rights battle, but in the end, It returned to being what it was supposed to be, a useful structure that serves the community. My signs serve a different purpose. They're a boundary, a statement that my property has limits, and those limits deserve respect. The two things coexist now, the communal shelter and the private signs, representing the balance we finally found between individual rights and community needs. I've been approached a few times about speaking at other neighborhoods dealing with HOA issues. People who have heard the story want advice on how to fight back against overreaching boards. I usually decline. This was never about being an activist or a crusader. It was about solving a specific problem in my specific situation. But I do offer one piece of advice when asked. Document everything. Keep receipts, take photos, save emails, know your governing documents better than the board does. Most HOA disputes come down to questions of fact and authority. If you have documentation proving your position, you're in a much stronger place than if you're just arguing based on memory or principle. And sometimes, I add, it helps to have leverage. The mailbox shelter was my leverage, the thing that made the board take me seriously when they'd been content to dismiss me before. Not everyone will have something like that. But most people have something, whether it's expertise the board needs, or documentation of board misconduct, or just the willingness to make things inconvenient enough that compromise becomes more appealing than continued conflict. It's been nearly 3 years since Patricia pulled my sign out of the ground. 3 years since I sent the notice about removing the mailbox shelter. 3 years since I learned more about property law, HOA governance, and neighborhood politics than I ever wanted to know. The neighborhood has moved on. New families have moved in. Others have moved out. The story of the mailbox shelter controversy is still told occasionally, usually to newcomers as an explanation for why our HOA board is more reasonable than most. I've become known as that guy who stood up to Patricia, which is fine. I've been called worse things. My business is doing well. The connections I've made in the neighborhood have led to other connections, other jobs, a solid reputation. Life is good. The drama is behind me. And every time I drive down my private driveway, past my properly installed and legally protected signs, I feel a small sense of satisfaction. Not because I won some petty battle, but because I proved something important. That individuals still have rights, even in HOA neighborhoods. That boards can be held accountable. That standing up for yourself, even when it's difficult, can lead to positive change. The mailbox shelter stands as well, serving its purpose, weathering storms both literal and metaphorical. It's a good structure built to last. I'm proud of it. I'm proud I built it, proud I fought to keep it standing, and proud of what it represents now. A community that learned to balance control with freedom, rules with rights, governance with respect. That's the real end of the story. Not a dramatic confrontation or a legal victory, but a gradual shift toward something better. A neighborhood that works a little more fairly, a board that operates a little more reasonably, and residents who understand they have both rights and responsibilities. And me, Victor Anderson, still living in my house at the end of Willow Lane, with my private driveway clearly marked and my mailbox shelter still standing strong, serving the community just like I'd always intended.